Is it just me? Or can things that evolutionists claim take long amounts of time actually happen very quickly?
It's not just you, sadly. For decades, there has been a growing epidemic of reality denial in this country, with anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, creationists, geocentrists, young earthers, flat earthers, Holocaust deniers, all manner of paranoid conspiracy theorists, and even some who think that the Matrix is real. Whoa. I actually know people who believe that extraterrestrial reptiles in human guise have infiltrated and dominated the Illuminati under the command of Jewish Freemasons who secretly worship the Christian devil. According to unwritten prophecies, they can only be interpreted by reading between the lines and ignoring the lines. Such that one prophecy that actually has come true is the movie Idiocracy. It is as if the majority of the U.S. and much of the rest of the world too has been infected with this inexcusable stupidity, not just you, Jane. In fact, it has gotten so bad that it may be time to change the name of our species to Homo irrationalis. We were obviously arrogant or unrealistically hopeful when we chose the name Homo sapiens, because we are clearly not man the wise anymore, if we ever were.
So Jane begins here with a rather common misunderstanding, and that's that the rate of natural processes is assumed without evidence, or simply extrapolated from some analog to unknown. For example, they might hear that a particular sequence of sedimentary rocks took millions of years to form, without understanding how geologists actually constrain the rate of deposition. Then, when they learn about an example in nature where sediments are deposited rapidly, like from a volcanic eruption, they think, aha, so it can happen either way. And secular geologists choose the slower rate to support their beliefs, so I can choose the opposite extreme to support mine. Why not? But that's not how geology works in practice. When we study any formation, it's not a question of how fast something could happen in nature under extraordinary circumstances, but rather how fast did it happen given the evidence. A good researcher will form multiple competing hypotheses regarding the process and rates, and then attempt to falsify each scenario. A poor researcher just creates a plausible sounding story and sticks to it no matter what, refuses to test it. And we'll see that play out in the rest of the clip.
There! Good, isn't it?
Jane, I got the new case. I got the heavy duty one, the heaviest duty one on the market. You could roll a truck over this baby.
I've always wanted to do this.
Hadn't put it on yet. Had not put it on yet. Oh no.
Oh no. Oh, you didn't. Oops.
Oh man. What normal person throws a phone?
Well, I never said I was normal. Okay, I'm so sorry. Puppy dog guys.
Well, you know, I'm not like upset. I was expecting a call from the scholarship board today. The process takes months, and if they can't contact me, it's just going to be that much longer.
We can do this, we can fix this. We just have to put the pieces back on the screen and then use this shipping tape to put it all back together.
Not gonna work.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. Who knew a phone could shatter so completely?
This is a nightmare.
No, it isn't. No, look, we can do this. We can do this. We almost got it done. See? Look. Here's Australia. Okay, look, that can go there. And then look, we already have Africa.
North America.
Yes, see? Now look, soon enough we'll have Pangea, and then your phone will be able to work.
Pangea? You mean the supercontinent?
Yeah, I was just reading about it for this week's homework.
We'll always have Pangea.
Let's see, it was page 162. Now, right here, they believe all the continents were together to form Pangea 225 million years ago.
But not everyone agrees, right?
True. Thousands of scientists believe in fast continental sprint rather than slow continental drift. One famous scientist by the name of Dr. John Baumgartner created a computer model for plate tectonics that thousands of geophysicists use to investigate Earth processes. His model has given us an understanding of how the continents split apart thousands, not millions of years ago.
I find it interesting how much stock they'll put into computer models, as long as we're not talking about radiometric dating or global warming. In that case, they're just models and interpretations. But thousands of scientists, I think that if you add up everyone in the world who has a degree in some scientific field and is also bought into Baumgartner's proposal of catastrophic plate tectonics, they might number in the thousands. But let's be clear, outside of Baumgartner and a few of his friends, no earth scientist and certainly no geophysicist has ever taken this idea seriously. It doesn't even make for good science fiction, to be honest.
Oh yeah, isn't he the creator of Terra?
Yep. In 1997, the U.S. News and World Report reported Terra was created by a Los Alamos lab scientist, the world's preeminent expert in the design of computer models for geophysical convection, the process by which the Earth creates volcanoes, earthquakes, and the movement of the continental plates.
So this part is true. Baumgartner did design a rudimentary Earth systems model to simulate convection of the mantle. I'm not going to criticize the model because honestly it worked fine in its time and sincerely good for him. But I do wonder if our ditzy duo here realizes just how many hundreds of such models are out there and how far computing has come in the last 2 decades, or more importantly, how to actually use an Earth systems model for research. Well, they are going to show us how not to use them.
Didn't he show that they can also move very quickly?
He set it up so that they could move very quickly in the simulation. It's kind of like using a model to show that Earth could orbit the Sun in only 6 months instead of 12. It's really easy to do. All you have to do is decrease the orbital radius from Earth to Sun. Now, is that true? Sure. But is it relevant to physical reality? No. And a key thing in science is that your predictive models have to fit observable reality. We can model anything, but if it doesn't match or predict observations, it's not a scientific model.
Right, but because the theory of evolution takes a long period of time to supposedly happen, many only accept uniformitarian ideas.
That's not why, and let me add some context here, in case you're unfamiliar with the history of creationism. The theory of plate tectonics was formalized in the 1970s, and it provided a mechanism to explain what had long been known, that the continents had rearranged over geological time, and this drove uplift and volcanism, earthquakes, and so forth. It further explained the origin of continental and oceanic crust. Now, since then, the theory has been so well corroborated that even young Earth creationists have decided, okay, we have to accept plate tectonics. The evidence is overwhelming, but it doesn't fit our timeline, so what do? Well, Dr. Baumgartner made a simulation in which he arbitrarily raised the temperature of the asthenosphere by a few hundred degrees. So it's kind of like heating solid wax until it actually becomes a lubricant and really easy to deform. And then he gave the tectonic plates a push, and the heat generated by that movement kept the boundary hot and relatively frictionless, so that plate motion was at least orders of magnitude faster than today. In his simulation, however, enough heat is generated to boil off much of the oceans and melt the crust. The only way to cool off the newly forming lithosphere, so that it matches modern observations, there is an ocean floor. The only way to cool that off, though, is to give it a steam bath. And yes, he really did propose this by circulating more than 1,000 meters of ocean evenly through tens of kilometers of semi-molten rock, which is then blown out to space by supersonic jets at plate boundaries. And let's not forget, catastrophic plate tectonics begins with a configuration that looks like Pangaea some 250 million years ago. But at the beginning of the Paleozoic, the continents were spread apart after the breakup of a much older Precambrian supercontinent called Rodinia. And before that, spread apart. And before that, another supercontinent. So even if the folks at the Creation Museum could explain how we got from Pangaea to today, or even from Rodinia to today within a few thousand years, which they can't, but if they could, they're not even close to explaining our tectonic history. So are you beginning to see why nobody takes this seriously? But hey, for the sake of discussion, let's try. As I said, it's not a question of how fast things could happen, but how fast did they, given the evidence. And there are thousands of lines of evidence from which we could constrain plate motions in Earth history, and by which we can rule out this asinine conjecture of catastrophic plate tectonics. So from radiometric dating of the ocean floor to see how long it took for that ocean floor to be generated, You can look at lavas on either side of a rift zone and compare the dates of those lavas with the modern observed rates of rifting according to high precision GPS, and they match extremely well. We can analyze the chemical alteration of the seafloor that happens around hydrothermal vents near the mid-ocean ridges. We could model the heat and buoyancy loss of oceanic crust as it moves slowly away from that ridge, all the way to correlating the height of ocean ridges with past glacial cycles. And yes, the thickness of ocean floor has varied along with sea level, which is driven by how much glacial ice is on land. Interestingly, the more water in the ocean, the heavier the weight that's pushing down on the seafloor and the thinner the oceanic crust will be. Not by a lot, but it's enough that we can track these cycles on the ocean floor and match them with the terrestrial climate records. So we can also look at subduction zones, how volcanic ranges are formed in response to subducting plates, which would not be the case if subduction were catastrophically rapid. We can track the latitude of continents through time by using the alignment of magnetic minerals in the rock. And these paleolatitudes just happen to correlate to the inferred climate history. For example, Cambrian limestones in Iowa must have formed on tropical shorelines, and that part of the continent just happened to be at like 10 degrees latitude. That's not a coincidence. So no, we don't suppose that plate tectonics is a slow process just because of an a priori commitment to uniformitarianism, which, by the way, is an already outdated concept.
Uniform a who?
Oh, it defines it right here. Geologists make inferences based on the principle of uniformitarianism. This principle states that the same processes that operate today operated in the past.
Not really. I wouldn't worry so much about the precise definition here because uniformitarianism stems from a time when geology was far more speculative and ruled by various schools of thought. Modern geology, by comparison, is so flooded with data that the guiding principle is basically, hey, if you think it happened really slow, like this, provide your evidence. If you think it happened fast, like this, provide your evidence. I mean, there's almost always a way to test your ideas thoroughly.
So they can determine the rate at which a river is currently cutting through a canyon and then use that to determine how old it is?
Correct. But what this principle refuses to take into account is the major catastrophic events of the past. Even many evolutionary geologists are starting to recognize the importance of regional catastrophes in understanding the geologic features on Earth.
You mean the way they always did? Because uniformitarianism means little more than that the laws of physical reality haven't arbitrarily changed, but remain constant. And creationists accept this too, saying that if the laws of physics were even slightly different, then life could not exist. Yet we're still here, so even creationists must accept this principle and admit that the laws of physics never changed. Uniformitarianism does not refuse to take anything into account. In fact, it was originally the other way around. You see, centuries ago, many Europeans held to the idea that the Earth was shaped by a series of catastrophes, volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and floods. But then some scientists, or natural philosophers as they were known in those days, figured out that while catastrophes do occasionally happen, like the planetoid impact that ended the Mesozoic era, or the flood basalt eruption that ended the Paleozoic era, those are the exception rather than the norm, and they were consequently responsible for very few natural structures and none of their systems. Instead, most formations came about very slowly through constant, gradual pressures and ongoing processes. However, the principle of uniformitarianism was largely rejected at first due to the prejudice of people preferring to pretend that the Earth and the whole universe had been made just for us, just before us, and the arrogance that there could not have been a long time in the distant past that was not all about humanity. Humans are so arrogant that many of us think that we have to be the center of everything, the reason that reality exists. Thus, it was the catastrophists who refused to take gradualism into account and would not even consider it, just as John and Jane are doing now, while accusing others of the very faults that they are guilty of, faults that we do not share with them.
Ooh. I think this might be the scholarship board. Quick, hand me South America.
Here. All right, here we go. Ready? Done. Go.
Please work. Hello?
Yes, I was calling to let you know your hearing aids are in.
What?
I said your hearing aids are in.
Oh, you've got the wrong number.
So I'm guessing that wasn't the scholarship board?
Nope. I probably missed their call. Now I'm not going to hear back from them for weeks or months.
Well, at least your phone works. Okay.
So, our textbooks say that rock layers take a long time to form.
Here's what we know about gradual processes. Since the 18th century, scientists have figured out plate tectonic movement, with the continents moving at an average of 3 to 5 centimeters per year, using mechanisms like subduction that have actually been confirmed. Yes, there are occasional earthquakes as a result, and they in turn may stir up devastating tsunamis and such, but even those catastrophes are part of a continual, gradual process. When the Indian subcontinent crashed into Eurasia, it pushed up the Himalayas from the seafloor, and they're still rising at a measurable rate of just 1 centimeter per year. We know that sea levels have risen and fallen in the distant past, and so have land masses. Texas, too, where I live, used to be underwater a couple of times in geologic history, which is how we got the Guadalupe mountain range, the highest elevation in the state. But this is not your typical mountain. This is a fossil coral reef. Now, the reason that creationists argue for catastrophism is because they're pleading for one particular catastrophe, which is directly related to this fossil reef. They're arguing for a worldwide flood from the fable of Noah's Ark. And one of many problems with that is that we know that under ideal conditions of calm seas and clear water, which would not be the case in a global flood, most corals will grow from 1 to as much as 2.5 centimeters per year. That's about as fast as it gets. However, conditions are hardly ever ideal, as they certainly wouldn't be in a global flood, and the whole coral reef will grow even slower than the individual corals themselves. Broken branches of corals being compounded into the sand and cemented by algae form the basis of coral reefs, resulting in a reef on the whole growing only a few millimeters per year. So this reef, more than 1,000 meters tall, would have taken at least 100,000 years under optimal conditions to form while the water was at that depth. 100,000 years under that much water. Calm, clear, salinated water. That's 10 times longer than John and Jane think the world existed, before the sea levels fell and the land rose also, both happening gradually and both obviously long before our time. There's a lot more data than just this to show that, way too much to get into here. The point is, creationists cannot account for any of this, nor can they even admit these facts because they have to defend their preferred belief, even when they know that all the evidence stands against it.
Have you heard about Mount St. Helens?
Yeah.
Okay, well, during the 1980s eruptions at Mount St. Helens, 200 layers of rock were deposited in 3 hours. Entire river systems were carved in a matter of months, right through 700 feet of hard rock. Examples like this cause geologists to rethink some of their previous ideas and give biblical creationists great models for the flood of Noah's day.
And what ideas exactly did we have to rethink after studying the deposits of Mount St. Helens? And these are volcaniclastic flows found in the vicinity of a stratovolcano. I mean, any competent geologist could examine those sediments and say, yeah, these layers probably formed quickly in connection with a large eruption. There are many examples of volcaniclastic deposits in the rock record, and guess what? Nobody mistakes them for slowly accumulating deep marine clays. The same goes for tsunami and flood deposits versus, beach bars and deltas. We can tell the difference. We don't just choose arbitrarily how it needs to have happened to support our ideology. And it reminds me of a saying, if you start with bad assumptions, you end up with bad... Wait, I heard that...
I mean, if you start with false assumptions, you could get really bad dates.
Last episode from you.
So imagine what a worldwide flood would do.
We actually know what such a large-scale flood would do. Here's how I explained that in a previous video. Toward the end of the last ice age, between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago in northern Idaho, the Purcell lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet combined with the topography of the Bitterroot Mountains, creating an ice dam that blocked Montana's Clark Fork River near what is now Sandpoint, Idaho. As glacial meltwater backed up behind the dam, it formed Lake Missoula, a huge lake, about the size of Lake Huron, stretching hundreds of miles back and up to 2,000 feet deep. So deep that it reduced the mountains to mere islands. and the shoreline of this ancient lake is still visible in the hillsides above the University of Montana. Of course, when the lake is that huge, a dam made only of ice will eventually fail in an instant, and the entire lake drains out of that one side. All of it, at once. 520 cubic miles of water in just 3 or 4 days. This was the Missoula Megaflood, the worst flood ever in geologic record. Imagine you're one of the people living there 15,000 years ago, and maybe hunting in the valley by the river, when suddenly there's a wall of water the width of the entire valley, a tsunami hundreds of feet high, coming not from the ocean, but from the highlands, roaring in at a mile a minute. There's nowhere to run and no time to get there, even if there was. In a moment, everything is swept away in a savage nightmare of epic proportions.
In places, the water was a staggering 800 feet deep. As this volatile torrent flowed ever more quickly, it gouged out miles of rock. It carved out cliffs and canyons, including the massive feature that is known today as Dry Falls. Meanwhile, huge underwater tornadoes were blasting out potholes. The bubbles that formed these tornadoes imploding with enormous force and penetrating deep into the bedrock below. As the chunks of ice from the original glacier were carried huge distances by the floodwaters, the boulders they contained within were randomly flung aside. When the floodwaters receded and the icebergs melted, they would reappear scattered all over the Scablands.
The Scablands. How did they get that horrible name? This unprecedented cataclysm left obvious markers all over the landscape, including places where the torrent stripped away all of the topsoil off of old lava flows and then gouged what was left into what are now the channeled Scablands. Look at the sort of damage done by the type of flood you were talking about. When seen from the air, the cause of the Scablands is obvious. The Missoula flood is closely associated with the Bonneville flood, a separate but similar event. They were both large backfilled lakes busting through ice dams, coming in from different places to deluge the same area, though not at the same time.
The flood scoured canyon walls and gouged holes in the canyon floor, creating Shoshone Falls and Twin Falls. The water ripped through the narrow reaches of the canyon, dislodging basalt boulders and tumbling them downstream. Where the flood channel widened, the boulders were heaped into impressive piles. The Bonneville flood then entered Hell's Canyon, the deepest canyon in North America, before joining the channeled Scablands of eastern Washington. The deposits left by the flood give us rich detail. Giant flood bars, more than 100 feet above today's Snake River, sit in narrow stretches of Hell's Canyon, showing us where the flood got choked up, creating flood stages hundreds of feet high behind it.
Notice that these floods overflowed the tops of 2 canyons that were already there, having been carved by the slow, continuous processes of the rivers flowing through them. But these torrential flash floods had entirely different effects on that area than what we see in the formation of Hell's Canyon, Snake River Canyon, or the Grand Canyon. The fast-moving water also left parallel, straight, streamlined hills, and one other feature unique to the megaflood. As hundreds of cubic miles of water was forced through a narrow area in just a few days, it deposited sedimentation in a pattern of enormous ripples.
Ripples are a great thing and a great visual to think about. So we've all been down to the river or down to the beach and seen ripples forming by the water. And usually the ripples we see forming on the beach, they're in shallow water, and these ripples are about an inch from one crest to the next. I've actually got some ripples here recorded in a rock, and you can see the difference from one crest to the next is about an inch. And this is a very natural process. It's due to the transport of sediment by the water moving over it. One of the real keys to breaking open the Lake Missoula story was when we realized that there were some ripples up in Camas Prairie just north of Missoula. But these were ripples where the distance between one crest to the next is now about 100 meters, or about a football field. And the height difference is about 3 meters, or about 10 feet. And we realized that these were ripples. They had to have been formed by water, but the scale of that water movement was nothing like what we are used to seeing. Must have been a huge flood, moving massive amounts of water and making ripples at a scale 100 times larger than we're used to seeing.
What might be even more interesting about the Missoula flood is that after the lake drained and there's no more pressure on the glacier, it refroze back into a wall again, which dammed up the river again, which backed up and filled up the lake again until it busted through again and again and again in a cycle of however many years between disasters. The Bonneville flood happened only once, but the Missoula flood happened at least a few dozen times before the end of the last ice age. The lake didn't always get back up to that same depth. It varied and was usually smaller, as was indicated in the hillsides where glacial Lake Missoula used to be. But that last flood followed a hard freeze, with the coldest average temperatures in the history of life on land, so that last one was a big one.
Gorgeous deposit. All these rocks were deposited by the Bonneville flood. Just one flood, right? Just a few weeks. All these rocks were dropped 17,400 years ago. Sitting on top are Missoula flood sediments. There are 20 different Missoula flood layers here. These are slackwater sediments from the Missoula floods. We're in Tammany Bar, just south of Lewiston, Idaho. Each of these is a separate Missoula flood. We're 150 miles upstream from Wallula Gap. That means water from Montana made it to Wallula Gap and had to back up this far up the Snake River drainage. This is one event, silt falling from the bottom of Lake Lewis, and another flood and another flood. Now that's amazing.
Exactly. So, here it says, these rock layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down over millions of years and were then slowly washed away by the river, forming a channel.
That's uniformitarian thinking again, isn't it?
Yes, that's thinking that the laws of nature haven't changed, that natural processes that work in the present work the same way in the past. And this is a principle that John and Jane are unwittingly adhering to right now.
Yup, if these rock layers took millions of years to form, then the bottom rock layers would be hard and brittle by the time the ones at the top would be deposited. But near Grand Canyon, all the layers are bent together. If they were bent together, well, they were hard. Snap.
I'm not even a geologist, and I know better than that.
The rocks didn't shatter like they should have. They must have been bent together while they were soft and pliable. The whole stack.
No, there was never a time when any whole layer was soft and pliable. And what you see in the Grand Canyon are older layers with almost all of the Cenozoic strata that used to be on top of them having been eroded away.
Sounds like you read a few articles by Andrew Snelling online and then just stopped there, when you should have spent more time in an actual structural geology course or taken a few field trips. Then you'd know there's no reason to expect those rocks to shatter like Snelling claimed and like you describe here. The strain from folding is released gradually through microprocesses like recrystallization of cements or slippage along bedding planes, or even through faults in fractures that could be very small or very large. Snelling began with a false premise. He tested a false hypothesis and even faked the results, to be honest, by collecting only from parts of the fold where deformation was minimal, and then concluding, hey, there's no deformation. But if you visit those rocks and view them up close, you know what you'll find? Lots and lots of fractures, just evidence that the strata were lithified and were solid prior to folding. So thanks, you just falsified your own story.
That means they were all deposited at about the same time, not over millions of years.
No, that means that all these layers were once compacted under Cenozoic strata, which has since eroded away. So all these remaining layers were already buried under significant pressure and remain so for thousands of millennia, which is the only way to fold these rocks this way without breaking them.
It is worth mentioning there are examples of soft sediment deformation in geology, and not all sediment layers harden at the same rate. And in some cases, cementation can be prevented or even reversed much later on by reducing or acidic waters. I mean, one common cause of this is an influx in hydrocarbons to the connate waters in the system. So even if Snelling's work in the Grand Canyon were solid, so to speak, it wouldn't contradict accepted geological principles. By the way, if you think that a lack of brittle deformation means that the strata were folded right after deposition, and that's somehow evidence of a large flood event, would you conclude that evidence of brittle deformation implies that a long time passed between deposition and folding? Because brittle deformation is everywhere in the rock record, like it's the rule, not the exception. So are you really sure you want to follow that argument to its conclusion?
So what about the canyon itself?
Well, if the river slowly carved the canyon, then we should see all the material piled up in a river delta. But it's completely missing. In fact, about 1,000 cubic miles has been eroded to form the Grand Canyon. Where did it all go? If the canyon was slowly eroded by the Colorado River, an enormous delta should be found at the mouth of the river where it empties into the Gulf of California. But the delta only contains about 1% of the eroded material we would expect if the evolutionary explanation were true.
Unless it was carved by a massive catastrophe, which carried all the material away.
That's what I think.
Creationists like to make up whatever they think is a quandary to science because they're scientifically challenged themselves. They don't even want to understand it. And then they ignore when the scientists correct them and just go on repeating the same mistakes even after they know it's wrong. For example, this claim that there is nowhere near enough sediment deposited at the mouth of the Colorado River to account for however many millions of years worth of erosion is creationist claim number 210, as logged in the Talk.Origins archive back in 1998. The explanation then, as now, is that the Colorado River Delta itself is quite extensive. It covers 3,325 square miles and is up to 3.5 miles deep, containing over 10,000 cubic miles of the Colorado River sediments from the last 2 to 3 million years. The sediments that were deposited by the river more than 2 to 3 million years ago have been shifted northwestward by movement along the San Andreas and related faults. Sediments have also accumulated elsewhere. Some are deposited in floodplains between the Delta and the Grand Canyon, such that some sediments from Colorado and Wyoming were blown as far as the Atlantic Ocean. And much of the strata exposed in the Grand Canyon are limestone and dolomite. These rocks would simply have eventually dissolved. And that's been the explanation for decades. But it's not like creationists will ever admit or correct a mistake. No, they'll just keep repeating the same errors forever as if they didn't know any better.
Check out what it says about fossils in our biology book. Even if an organism lives in an environment where fossils can form, the chances are slim that its dead body will be buried in sediment before it decays. So, animals have to be quickly buried in sediment so its cells can be preserved and then replaced by the surrounding minerals.
That really depends on the environment. Marine shells and vertebrate teeth are pre-fossilized, so to speak, and they can survive conditions that skin, muscle, hair cannot. They can even be eroded from older strata and reworked into new sediments like pebbles or grains of sand. In fact, terrestrial environments preserve almost exclusively things like teeth or shells or vertebrae fragments. Other bones are quite rare in comparison, as we'd expect, because they break down too quickly. And when bones are preserved, they almost always show evidence of weathering on the surface. That's how we know that fossilization in general had nothing to do with catastrophes or really rapid burial, but everyday processes that we observe today. And if that weren't the case, then why do we find fossils in quaternary deposits from just about every environment? I mean, young Earth creationists almost invariably believe that these layers formed after the flood and not catastrophically. So which is it? Do they need to be buried rapidly in a global catastrophe, or can they be buried and fossilized in normal conditions?
Okay, so check out this fossilized clam.
You have fossilized clams in your purse.
Yeah, they hurt in my pocket. Anyway, so what happens to a clam when it dies?
No more homework?
No. They open up and their two shells separate. But this clam was fossilized before it had a chance to fall open or be pulled open by a scavenger.
No, it was not fossilized while it was still alive. As this article explains, fossilized clams are like time capsules. When they die, fine sediment and particles can become trapped inside them. Sometimes even dead fish, or in one case, a dead ammonite, might settle into these open cups. Then, if two valves are still connected, as they often are, then when the clam is buried, by the surf perhaps, then they're forced to close again by the pressure from the outside in the act of being buried. And this makes them excellent record keepers of their time, if you can detect the contents that got in there after the clam died and opened, and before the burial closed it again.
They've also found fossils of a fish coming out of another's mouth. How quickly did that get fossilized?
Not fast enough.
The smaller fish was not coming out of the other one's mouth. The fish that give birth live don't do it out that end, and they wouldn't come out tail first if it's a fish that has gills and all that. Now, what happened here was that the larger fish tried to eat more than it could swallow. It couldn't cough the other fish back out without both fish moving backward, and fish don't have a reverse gear. And that means that this fish effectively choked on its meal, and since it can't run water over its gills without obstruction there, so both fish died, which means that they would have floated to the surface, as dead fish do, a short distance from the shore where it would have washed up and then was buried, either by the surf or by landslides, such as we see happening all the time whenever a hillside meets a shoreline.
Or what about a marine reptile caught giving birth?
Awkward.
Yeah.
No, it was not fossilized while giving birth. Things don't turn to stone and then get buried. This animal was an ichthyosaur, and they are what you would get if you tried to make a dolphin out of a lizard. And this is what evolution does, but a creator would not do. So their very existence is an argument against intelligent design, and we have quite a lot of evidence for ichthyosaur evolution. Being air-breathing reptiles, they had to give birth live and backwards, tail first, like whales do. Now, live birth is more dangerous than laying eggs, and live birth underwater probably compounds the risk, as there are several fossils of ichthyosaurs in this condition. So death during childbirth was obviously a problem for them. And again, when that happens, since this was not a death by predation, then the body may be washed to the shore and buried the way that everything that washes onto the shore tends to be. But you know what would not happen to an air-breathing ichthyosaur in a worldwide flood? It wouldn't drown. Nor would a marine reptile be suddenly buried in a global flood either. It doesn't matter how much salt or silt is in the water. They're going to be at the surface either way, anyway, and already in deep water, so it wouldn't matter to them. All plant life would die, and all soil horizons everywhere would be destroyed forever, with no way for vegetation to ever come back from this. All the ichthyosaur's food would die, as gilled fish could not survive that either. Even most microbes would be wiped out by such a flood. So the ichthyosaurs would eventually starve to death in a world that could never recover from such an impossible inundation. But they wouldn't be drowned and buried like this. They absolutely could not be fossilized in the act of giving birth while they're still alive. You must be pretty desperate to defend your fable if you're willing to make up a fib like that.
And they found many dinosaur bones with red blood cells, soft tissue, proteins, and even DNA.
No, they didn't.
How quickly would that have to be buried before it deteriorated?
And have it last for 70 million years? There's no way.
That's because it didn't last. Well, some proteins can, like collagen, which are incredibly durable, difficult to break down, and still they're only preserved as highly degraded organometallic compounds. But otherwise, the microscopic quantities of soft tissue, which are only found deep inside large, well-insulated bones, had to be effectively unfossilized or demineralized by being soaked in an acid bath for weeks. And there were no blood cells either, just like there's no actual bones, just the lithified fossils of bones. The traces of blood cells are the fossilized remnants of blood, the iron-based molecule called heme. And regardless what you may have seen in blockbuster movies, they never found any dinosaur DNA. At best, they may have found decayed remnants of organic molecules, not 70 million year old DNA. The oldest genetic material yet confirmed came from a mammoth that lived 1.2 million years ago.
But all of these could have been fossilized during the worldwide flood.
Right.
Wrong. There was no worldwide flood. That is not remotely possible for lots of different reasons, and even if it was miraculous, we still have ample evidence that it never happened. And we have a good idea what did happen, what actual event the original fables were based on that were later altered and adapted into a new version to eventually be included into the Bible.
Noah's flood would create many of the rock layers that stretch over entire continents and bury millions of creatures for us to find as fossils today.
No, the fabled flood of Noah's Ark could not possibly have formed geostratigraphy, And most of our best preserved fossils around the world imply long periods of relative calm, even after volcanic events like an ashfall or emission of poison gas or anaerobic conditions, even isolated flash floods or tsunamis, but nothing like a global flood.
So let's entertain that idea for the sake of argument. If that were the case, all fossils would be around 5,000 years old or less. So why doesn't every layer preserve soft tissues in abundance or DNA that can be sequenced? I mean, why don't we have a trilobite genome yet? And why does the preservation potential decrease exponentially with stratigraphic age if they were all formed during the same event or shortly after? In fact, these so-called soft tissue finds are extraordinarily rare in anything older than the Quaternary. So every time you hear somebody argue for the flood and recent creation because soft tissue, turn it around on them, see if they can be consistent. I guarantee they can't.
It doesn't take millions of years to form fossils. It can happen rapidly under the right conditions.
I guess it all comes down to what it says in 2 Peter chapter 3, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, "Where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they will willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water, and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water."
The Bible is not the Word of God. Neither is the Quran, nor the Book of Mormon, nor the Adi Granth of the Sikhs, nor any of the many Hindu scriptures that are older than the Bible. If the Bible had been written by God, then it wouldn't adhere to the traditional belief in a flat, disc-shaped world wherein the land is standing out of the water and in the water. If a God truly existed, then it wouldn't have caused a global flood either, which was only possible in the flat earth model anyway. And finally, remember that there was always scoffers, especially since Jesus said his second coming would be in the 1st century, while at least some of his apostles were still alive. There were scoffers then, and there were scoffers long before then, too, and other messiahs as well. According to Paul, who basically invented this whole religion, angels may be preaching other gospels. How could that be? And we know that there were other apocryphal gospels, more than a dozen of them, and there were other Christs, too, not just the 19 or 20 Jesuses that Josephus talked about, but as Pilate noted in that movie,
"You Jews produce messiahs by the sackful."
They deny the worldwide flood.
Of course we do. I mean, we're not stupid. We know better than that. We know that the flood never happened. We know it because we can show it. We can prove that it never happened. And there are even Christian colleges who will not teach flood geology because they know it's indefensible nonsense.
Yes, this is John. Really? 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 All right, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll talk to you then. Guess who that was?
That was the scholarship board. Did that go well?
Yes!
Yes!
I got the scholarship. I thought I was gonna have months of paperwork. And I just got it, just like that.
Oh, congratulations, John.
Yeah, I guess things you think are gonna take a really long time can sometimes happen very rapidly.
You know, a lot of people have that experience at your age, but hang in there. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Even love takes practice.
Yep. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
No, Jane. Your attempted obfuscation is deliberately deceptive, dishonest, and designed to make your listeners stop thinking, to shut up and believe whatever they're told to believe, even when you know that it's not really true.